I'm going to talk about something which is very, very important. As obesity becomes epidemic globally as well as in India, we need to look at what are the causes for that. And one of these is food cravings. And I wanted to talk a little bit about food cravings in the context of what are they, what causes them, how to think about it from a mechanistic detail, and then what are the things you can do to prevent them. So join me on the channel. I hope you enjoy this. Hey guys, Dr. Nene here. I practice as a cardiothoracic, vascular, and general surgeon, and I'm now a health tech innovator who wants to improve lifespans and lifestyles. So stay healthy, stay curious, and keep watching. As always, we're so appreciative for all your support, and that's reflected both in our subscriber numbers and in our videos. But don't forget to hit the like, subscribe, and share, and make sure that you hit the bell icon so that when our new videos come up, we can help you decipher your code. Join us on the channel. So we're gonna do this a little different. Rather than me just talking at you, I'm gonna do this as a question and answer so that it seems like you guys are scripting the dialogue. And then I'll answer as best I can. Now remember, I'm not an expert in some of these topics, but every time I do one of these videos, I learn. And let's face it, life is about learning. When I stop learning, I'm no longer living. And I want you to learn with me and continue your life journey. So here goes.
Hey doc, what are cravings and how common are they?
So, great question. Over 90% of people have some type of craving. And the cravings are something which is object related with visual or sensory cues, which cause you to do an action with eating or other types of behavior. The interesting part is that they should be distinguished from appetite, where there's a physiologic need, in that cravings don't necessarily happen because you're hungry, but can be increased by hunger and the actions you do with that. We'll talk about that later. So the key take home is that a craving is a little bit different than a hunger instinct where you're trying to meet your physiologic or nutritional needs.
What hormonal or neurological factors influence cravings?
So there's a lot of temporal and physiologic things related to cravings, and they can occur under many different circumstances. In women, for instance, during their menses and during their ovulation, it's thought that the hormones are in such a state that they may get cravings. Similarly, during pregnancy, it's often seen that women get significant cravings. These are driven by various hormones, which we'll talk about and show you a chart on. But the idea is that there's a cause and effect, that they get the cravings whether they're hungry or not. So it's not a physiologic need to get nutrition, but instead something which is driven by object or visual cue, and then augmented by the hormones. The interesting thing about it is the neuroendocrine basis of cravings are becoming understood. And there's a chart here which we'll put up, which talks about the different hormones that are involved, and whether it's ghrelin, oxytocin, GLP-1, which is glucagon-like peptide, or other things involved with this. There is significant evidence now that all of these change. Moreover, there's some studies now which look at neuroimaging and show what parts of the brain light up when you see a visual cue and get a craving. So as we move forward, we're going to start to understand the basis of cravings. Now, the interesting thing is dopamine is involved with this. And dopamine is sort of a happiness hormone in that it goes up or spikes when you have something pleasant or have a response. Now, the interesting part is there's these D2 receptors which are normally associated with dopamine's effect, and they get downregulated when you give a lot of stimulus, and as a result you need more and more to achieve that. The ironic part, as I was researching this, is we found with cravings, when it goes from a craving to an addiction, and we're talking addiction medicine now, it becomes potentially harmful. And the interesting part is cravings and addictions can actually be related and seen in the same response in the brain with the neuroendocrine markers and the parts of the brain that light up to drug addictions. And so it, for me, was a little bit scary when I saw all of this and said, wow, could simple cravings, which make you obese or potentially put you in harm's way, be something which could actually be related to other things? The other question is, are there genetic reasons? And there are some genetic markers for some types of cravings. Lastly, there's other states where you can have cravings, like if you have low iron or some types of hormonal issues, PCOS for instance, which has huge fluctuations in your estrogen, testosterone, and other things in women with cysts in their ovaries potentially, or other things, which can lead to cravings, overeating, obesity, and all of the concomitant side effects. And so it was very interesting to me that there's a lot of things. It's not a one variable equation, in other words. There's many different things that can lead to cravings. The ideal is to figure out why. Is it a physiologic problem, meaning not hunger related, but something which is caused by a hormonal imbalance? Secondly, is it psychological? And is it something which you've learned, like maybe you got rewarded every time you did something well by going to the donut shop. And therefore, every time something good happened, you'd go to the donut shop, and that became a cause and effect. And then third, what are the effects that occur as a result of that? So that's what I think about. Now, you're in a movie theater like this, and we thought this scene would be emblematic of what we're talking about. But what is the first thing you do when you go to a movie theater? I don't know about you, but I always buy caramel popcorn. It's almost a reflex. Even if I'm full, I have to have that taste. So that's a craving, right? And there you go. This gives you sort of the details.
So Doc, how do psychological factors like habits or learned behaviors affect cravings? And are there any lifestyle changes that can help us combat this?
Yeah, so let's go with the first one first. Psychological factors definitely can lead to cravings and/or binge eating and/or food addiction. For instance, stress eating can be a very dominant problem for many of us, and it happens when you're completely stressed out and you use food as solace. Now, some of that with carbohydrates and with fat can actually act as a means to suppress some of the stress and whatnot. But in reality, it's actually a negative influence on most people and can lead to a cycle where your insulin spikes after the sugar spikes, and then you go low and you feel actually more down. And so not the best move to do that. The way to combat that would be several-fold. And remember, it's not an appetite thing where you're doing it to meet your physiologic or hunger needs. You're actually doing it because it's a psychological thing. And so let's divide that up, right? One approach would be to eat protein or complex carbohydrates, which burn much slower and are there for longer periods of time. And that, because of that, you're not hungry. Because there's one behavior where you've been trained to get the quickest source of satisfaction when you're hungry. I can tell you my kids do that, and they jump to the cookies when they're really hungry rather than eating substantive things. And my wife and I have this argument every time. She's like, yeah, you know, they're kids, they can afford to have a few cookies, they're not gonna get obese, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, look, I think if we train them on what their go-to snacks are to be healthy things like carrot sticks or celery, and maybe once in a while you have an occasional cookie, fine. But the concern is that if they go to cookies, which do provide you with very fast sugars, then the bottom line is that's what they'll do every time, and it can then be prone to use in anxiety or other things. And so the way to turn that around is through different techniques. One is mindfulness. The idea is to shift the focus away from weight loss to the process of eating. And it may be chewing your food longer, it may be enjoying it with the stimulation you get, it may be thinking through what you're doing. From a metabolic standpoint, the interesting part is digestion is many things. There's a cephalic phase where you see it, smell it, sense it, and it starts to get your brain hormones working to increase your salivation or your saliva in your mouth. It increases in your abdomen the amount of gastric acids. And then as things hit your tongue with taste, the taste buds and the tongue will actually stimulate even more. And then as you masticate, you chew, that brings you one more phase. And then when it drops into your stomach, all sorts of hormones kick in, like cholecystokinin. The truth is, it can take up to 30 minutes to get satisfaction from eating. So if you're eating fast, chances are you'll eat more than you actually need. And the truth is that by 30 minutes, you're gonna feel overfull. And so, the Japanese have talked about it, and we'll veer into this in the obesity talk, but the idea is to be 80% full and to eat slowly, chew regularly, and really enjoy your food, and try to focus when you eat. The second thing is what you eat matters, right? If you're eating high sugar substrates and whatnot, they have a very different effect on you. And to distinguish between a craving, where you go after those cookies late at night, like this guy, or when you're going to the movies and you have your caramel popcorn, nothing wrong in and of itself once in a while. But the problem is, don't make it into a habit. So the other thing one person taught me is that sugars, if you are used to adding sugars in whatever format, whether it's refined sugar, and we've talked about this in another episode, that is sugar the real enemy? I think it is, because diabetes is on a huge upswing and it's epidemic, along with morbid obesity, but more importantly, it's been related to all kinds of other diseases like heart disease, diabetes, and cancers and other things. The idea is, if you're used to putting 2 spoons of sugar in tea without even trying it, then your taste is habituated to that. So the way to change that is to be mindful about that and basically try having no sugar in your tea for 7 days or longer. And chances are you won't crave it and your taste will be rewired. They've talked about 21 days to new habits and all that. That's actually a myth of some sorts, because it was originally created by a plastic surgeon to recognize, after you'd had a plastic surgery, how many days it took before you recognized that there was a new you in the mirror. But the truth is, everyone's different. Non-absorptive sweeteners change your craving for sweets. Well, the answer is probably not. Now, the question is, does it spike your insulin the same way? In some cases, yes, some cases, no. There's some studies that show sucralose or Splenda or whatnot will spike it, whereas stevia won't. But the point is the same, that you're craving sweets. So I would say, if you can cut out the sweets as much as you can, and if anything, use natural sweeteners like fruit, for instance, to do it, or have a piece of fruit rather than a refined sugar sweet, you're better off. Cognitive behavioral therapy. Well, the jury's still out for that particular type. CBT is used very regularly in various settings as a means to train people out of fears, out of sort of behavioral things, but it's never been shown to aid directly in obesity. There's been several studies on this. And so I think we need to be very clear that it's not the only thing you look at when you're doing it. And then the other interesting thing I found is, with these cravings versus hunger, when they did the neural imaging, there were parts of your brain which lit up. Interestingly, with food addiction, it was very similar to drug addiction. The same places lit up in the brain. And so the question is, can you use some of the same techniques for food addiction and or cravings? And the answer is probably can. But in the case of drug addiction, it's something which is physiologic. And to some degree, as we learn the neurotransmitters, food craving and food addiction might be in the same genre.
So Doc, how do you prevent cravings?
So I would define the craving and see if it's physiologic, meaning from a hormonal basis. And I think eventually we're going to find out that all of these things are related to neurotransmitters, or whether it's psychological, right? So what do we think about with physiologic? reasons for cravings. If you have PCOS, or you have pregnancy induced, or you have low iron stores or other reasons, those can be treated or at least mitigated. In the case of pregnancy-related cravings, it's very hard. And I can tell you, every woman who's been pregnant, particularly in the third trimester, it seems like, are making their husbands go on runs for peanut butter and pickles and other things, depending on the person. In those cases, perhaps you can give some satisfaction to them because you know they're self-limited. The only time they can become harmful is if you are using a lot of sugar or whatnot, get into gestational diabetes, or have other issues. One doesn't cause the other, by the way, it's a hormonal thing, but you are feeding the fuel. So if you understand that, you can do it. In the case of PCOS, you can correct the underlying disease, which is normally corrected with a BCP or birth control pill, which regulates the hormones. But you have to recognize that that's the case. In the case of other types of things with low iron stores, with pica, where you're eating dirt and ice and stuff like that, that's something where if you correct the iron stores, you actually get better. Now, in the case of psychological cravings, you have to figure out what is triggering your cravings. Is it anxiety eating? Is it depression eating? Is it binge eating? And then you have to combat that and replace the behavior with something better. One of the ways to do this is to correct the sources that you're doing so you're not hungry. Now remember, we said this before, cravings aren't the same as hunger or appetite, right? Because appetite is something which is driven by your brain and your stomach and your system to satisfy your nutritional needs. In the case of cravings, they don't necessarily do that. There's something which is soft-wired and sometimes neurotransmitter hardwired, but in most cases correctable. And so in the case of hunger, if you can stay away from hunger, because I don't know about you guys, but my eyes get bigger than my stomach when I'm hungry, and then I go on a binge and tear into then the cravings for foods which make me happy, which are usually the high carbohydrate, sugary foods, or in the case like post-call, where we'd have the high fat or high sugar foods, and you would feel great after that. And they were a nice way to get over the fact that you just worked 40 hours straight or more as a resident or as an attending. And I'm sure some of you guys, when you're sitting there, sitting there working at some type of startup or in another job where you don't have a break, end up with that. But I would say have healthy snacks around, right? Have protein nibbles, have other things which will keep your hunger sated, as well as be something which is light in calories and high in protein so that you don't have to deal with it. The second thing is make sure you drink enough water, right? There's some good studies for obesity which suggest if you have 500 cc's of water before you eat, that you actually eat less because your stomach is full. And so has that been shown to reduce BMI and obesity? No, it hasn't. Psychologically and physiologically, that it does fill up the stomach, and so you really can't eat as much. The third thing is plan out your meals. Make sure that you don't leave gaps. Now, we're playing with hunger versus cravings, and the two can get interrelated. If you get really hungry, then you go after the first thing you have. But the cravings we were talking about are more psychological and to some degree physiological, rather than the hunger which you have. But hunger will contribute to that. The fourth thing is don't starve yourself. So this all plays together, right? It's becoming a trend where you're planning out your meals, you're having snacks, you're not allowing yourself to do it. I don't know about you guys, but when I'm sleepy, tired, or whatnot, I will eat more carbs. And that was the post-call trick for us. But the problem is, as soon as you ate the carbs, you would get a huge sugar spike, then a huge insulin spike, and then go to bed. And you'd get really sleepy. And I'm sure after a big meal, if you know the south of India, they always have a siesta where the shops are closed for 2 hours. There's a reason for that. When you're eating a huge bongo plate with lots of rice, that's what happens, right? And so the bottom line is, if you have more protein and less carbs, you may not get as sleepy afterwards, but it may also knock out some of your cravings later. The last thing is distract yourself, right? if you've got a craving, get up and walk, right? Try to do something else. There were several studies which showed that if you chewed gum or you did something else, you could basically satisfy whatever craving you had, and it changed the habit, that you went from one thing to another. Instead, you put something in between, which basically took away that, and then you were back to work. And then finally, how do you reduce stress, right? I don't know about you guys, but you can get stress-reduced cravings. Now, the interesting thing, and we'll talk about it in another episode, and we put up the chart on it, all the hormones. One of those is glucagon-like peptide and the incretins. There's been a huge advance with Ozempic, Wegovy, and Mounjaro, and those were originally used to treat diabetes. We're going to talk about all of those in another episode because I know you guys are dying to understand and hear about them. It's all the rage in the US, and now even in India, people are using it for weight loss with or without diabetic indications. And to be honest, it's accepted with Ozempic and Wegovy for weight loss because it has been shown to do it. But the idea is that what we're realizing is a lot of these hormones knock out the desire to eat. In other words, as Oprah puts it, your food noise is gone and you're not just craving, you just eat when you have to. And sometimes you don't even want to eat, you kind of force yourself on a schedule. And so we'll talk about that in another episode, but those may be the way to break some of the habits. If you remember from the Should I Smoke episode, we talked about how we wiped out the desire to smoke. And part of that was psychological, and part of that was physiological, in that you were addicted to the nicotine. In the case of food addictions, you're not quite addicted. A lot of it's psychological, but the neurotransmitters are there, and the D2 receptors they're finding now are downregulated when you eat a lot of stuff. The interesting thing is, when you have these other types of meds coming in, a lot of them are proven now, not just investigational, in silencing some of these cravings. So in the worst cases, if you're getting morbid obesity from the cravings and then the concomitant eating behaviors, they might be the bridge to retraining yourself. And time will tell, but there's some good studies, and we'll talk about it in another episode as noted. But that would be the other thing. Finally, look, there's no reason why you can't have something you enjoy once in a while. The only thing is it shouldn't lead to a food addiction, nor should it lead to a repetitive behavior, which in my estimation will end up badly. And so the idea is try to figure out what the cause is, whether it's physiologic from hormonal issues or from other things, or whether it's psychological and it's a trained habit. And then go after the reasons for this and figure out how you're gonna, attack it. We've talked about some ideas of what to do with hunger. They're not really things you do with craving, except for the distraction part. Mindfulness is the other thing we talked about, CBT to a lesser degree. We also talked a little bit about the different drugs now which are available, which in the worst cases, when you're obese, have diabetic complications or have other issues which are indications for use for these. And to be honest, people are using them off-label and without indication these days because, let's face it, you can never be too skinny is the mantra, which I don't necessarily agree with. I think you're all beautiful and you should accept that inside and out. But the idea is that if you are getting into trouble, that these might be the adjunct. I hope this has helped. We'll cut it down to a reel for viewing purposes so that you figure out 5 ways to figure it out and solve it. But again, remember that we're very thankful for you guys watching, and I'm hoping this has helped with cravings and why they occur, what they are versus hunger, and what are the different approaches to solving for them mechanistically, and then what you can do to actually solve for them in real time and for the long term. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Remember to like, subscribe, and share because that's what drives this channel. I'm very appreciative because our numbers are growing, obviously, and you guys have commented to me. The best is when I go places and you guys come up to me and talk about episodes. And the crazy part is you all love my cooking and my family episodes. And then a whole cadre of you are coming up to me and asking me questions about some of the medical episodes and thanking me for that. So thank you very much for watching and enjoying what we're doing. And make sure you leave comments below so that I can figure out how to navigate and what I can bring to you, because we did this for you guys. And honestly, it's fun for me to learn. I'm not an expert in all these things, and I'm happy to get feedback from you guys if there's something you see which is different than what you've heard. And in addition to that, we do bring experts on the channel. And so we'll keep mixing it up. Join me for the next episode. Look forward to seeing you soon.